So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this important program on a very important topic. This program is Hope for Healing, Human Trafficking, and Mental Health Considerations. We are happy to be joined by Kirsti Mouncey and Alicia Ley from the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking. And my name is Matt Gasecki, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator from NAMI Greater Cleveland. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about NAMI before I allow our two presenters to introduce themselves and begin their presentation. As I said before, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on the NAMI Greater Cleveland YouTube channel later this week. These slides will also be made available for you after the presentation. There's also an evaluation that I would like you to complete before we end. If you have questions, we will, since we're a smaller group today, we'll definitely have time to answer your questions. Please just use the chat feature. I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation and will gently interrupt our presenters if you have a question that pertains to the specific slide that they're speaking about. And please also remember to remain muted throughout the presentation. So just a little bit more about the National Alliance on Mental Illness and NAMI Greater Cleveland. For those of you that are not as familiar with us, NAMI is a grassroots organization that was founded in 1979 in Wisconsin by a group of mothers of children with mental illness. And they formed NAMI as a kind of grassroots coalition around their kitchen tables because they were really not satisfied with the lack of support and acknowledgement and education in their local communities around the reality of living with mental illness in your family. NAMI is now the largest grassroots mental health organization of its kind and is represented by state or local affiliates in all 50 states. And NAMI Greater Cleveland is the local affiliate that serves Cuyahoga County. Our mission is dedicated to empowering those living with mental illness and their families to achieve a better quality of life through education, support, information and referral, and advocacy. We do all kinds of community outreach and education, some that's open to the public, such as programs like this. Also work with law enforcement, universities, schools, hospitals, corporations. We offer support groups for people with mental illness, support groups for family members of people with mental illness. We have a helpline that's available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, that can answer questions and provide information and referral about appropriate local resources related to mental health or substance use treatment, as well as other services that may be needed for someone living with mental illness. And NAMI is also engaged in the work of advocacy. At the national level, NAMI is very involved in research. At the national and state levels, NAMI is very involved in legislative advocacy to make mental health a public health priority, maximize funding for mental health services, generally create more humane options for treatment, and ensure that peer and family voices are heard and integrated into decision-making about mental health services. So that's NAMI in a nutshell. With that being said, I am going to turn it over to our two presenters, Kirsti and Alicia, to introduce themselves and begin our presentation. Thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you, Matt. It was exciting to learn a little bit about your organization. I love that we started with moms, like moms and their kids can just tackle the world, can't they? And we're a grassroots organization as well, so we're excited to be here.
Correct, correct. So many similarities. When you advocate for a cause, there are a lot of things that overlap and we have in common. So thank you everyone so much for joining us at this lunchtime hour on the topic of hope for healing. And I really love that title because there's always hope for healing, and the topic of human trafficking and mental health considerations. We are the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking. My name is Kirsti Mouncey. I am the president and CEO here at the Collaborative. Before joining the Collaborative, I spent many, many years in the mental health world, working with human trafficking victims, survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and other traumas. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. And I thank you again all for joining us on this very important conversation. The Collaborative to End Human Trafficking, as Alicia says, is also a grassroots organization with a vision that hopes that one day we will see a world without human trafficking, one community at a time. The Collaborative to End Human Trafficking was founded in 2007, pretty shortly after the Trafficking Victim Protection Act passed in 2010, which was and still is a federal law that really gave voice to people who are trafficked in our communities and said that there's trafficking everywhere. You saw our poster on our front slide. It happens here too. Human trafficking is a worldwide problem. And for a long time, people sort of thought, you know, it happens in other countries. It's affected other continents, but it really does happen in this country and in every community. And Alicia will talk a little bit more about prevalence and what it looks like. So the collaborative is here to lead, empower, and connect our community to eradicate human trafficking. And we do that by lots and lots of awareness raising and education. We want people to be aware that this is an issue that happens in our communities. We want them to have tools to spot human trafficking and to respond when they recognize signs and symptoms of human trafficking. We're also here to connect the many, many providers and systems and resources in our community that potentially and often interact with survivors of human trafficking. So just like NAMI, we work with law enforcement, we work with universities, we work with schools, we work with social service providers, we work with our hospital systems, all of whom have a big role to play in treating survivors, supporting survivors, and referring survivors to the best possible services. We also provide technical assistance and training for organizations who want to get better at serving survivors that they see coming through their doors. And we are the backbone organization for a very large coalition, which we call Greater Cleveland Coordinated Response to End Human Trafficking, because we believe that only if we come together and break down these silos that exist between our organization and systems, can we truly create transformative change. So that is what we're here to do, is support everyone else in our community who does this work. So I'm going to turn it over to Alicia now, and she'll give us a broad stroke overview of human trafficking, what it looks like. And then I'll be back in just a little while to tell you a little bit more about the mental health consideration of victims and survivors.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Alicia Ley. I'm a program coordinator at the Collaborative, and just excited to be here today. This is going to be a very high overview of human trafficking, like 50,000 feet view, real quick. So I would encourage you, so that we can get to the content of what that has to do with our mental health community. But I would encourage you, if you haven't had human trafficking training, we offer a very in-depth hour training every month. You can follow us online and sign up for that too. So if you're like, oh, I wish there was more, there is more, you can sign up. But to get us started, we want you to know that there are two broad categories of human trafficking. So there's sex trafficking, and there's also labor trafficking. So under the law, those are the two broad forms. Really, since 2000, since the United States has had this law on the books, for whatever reason, sex trafficking has gotten more of the spotlight, kind of more of the education and awareness. But it's important to know that labor trafficking is real too. It's happening in Northeast Ohio, across our country, and across our world. And it really affects some of our industries in Northeast Ohio as well. So just for definition, we want to make sure everyone understands the definition of what we're talking about. So the current U.S. trafficking in persons law is there for you on the screen. So I won't read it for you, but I'll point out a couple of keywords. So in both the sex trafficking law as well as the labor trafficking, there are kind of three magic words, if you will, that are really important, which are force, fraud, or coercion, which is what makes these things illegal, right? The words force, fraud, or coercion, you want those to stick into your mind. For sex trafficking, what's important to note is that those words in green, a commercial sex act, right? It doesn't have to be the exchange for intercourse for money. It can be the exchange of any sexual act for anything of value. And that thing of value can be shelter, it could be food, it could be a drug of choice, it could be a medication. So whatever that is, it can be the exchange of something of value for that victim in a forceful, fraudulent, or coercive way. And you'll see those words again on the side of the labor trafficking for different things, for labor and exploiting labor as well. Now, what's important to note about commercial sex and sex trafficking, so if you click the next screen, under the law in all 50 states, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So those magic words go away if we're talking about our minors. Any minor, by law, that's involved in commercial sex is a victim of sex trafficking, because we know that they can't consent to being there. So the next slide just shows a different way to organize this information. Some people are more visually oriented, so it kind of breaks down what is done, how it's done, and you'll see those things, and then the purpose, why it's done. Now, it's important too, when we look at the means there, how it's done, right? There's been a myth that we've seen in our field that so much of trafficking is connected to that word force, right? Kind of that picture of the movie Taken, of the teenage girl hiding under the bed and being pulled out, right? Or kidnapping, the big white van's going to kidnap your teenager at the mall. Largely what we've seen is that in the United States, domestic trafficking, that is not what's happening. So much more often, it's these fraudulent, coercive relationships. And just like any other gendered violence or sexual violence that we know of, the large majority of this happens in the context of a relationship of some sort. It's either a family member, someone the victim has known before, sometimes romantic relationships as well. So real quick, we're going to talk through what are some vulnerabilities. And I think this is pertinent to our mental health community, because so much so you'll see the overlap of this generational, cultural, historical trauma that builds up a lot of times in the environment around us, but also in our family systems as well. And we see those kind of overlap with our mental health considerations of what may make someone vulnerable for trafficking. So what we do know about trafficking is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Instead, it happens in correlation with other persistent, current historical injustices and disparities that have existed really within our society and our economy, and in our political sphere since the beginning of our country, really. So some people groups experience trafficking at a disproportionate rate. And so data shows the majority of trafficking victims, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, this is data for both of those categories, in the United States are identified as people of color, our indigenous communities, our immigrant communities, and people who identify as LGBTQ+. So again, the overlap with the mental health, you'll see that these groups also oftentimes experience mental health at a larger proportionate rate as well. So other vulnerabilities that we see prevalent in domestic trafficking, but really right here in Northeast Ohio with the victims that and survivors that we work with. If you want to click to the next slide, there we go. And you can click through a couple. Just there we go. So vulnerabilities for sex trafficking. So we talked about the populations who have experienced inequities. Poverty, sometimes poverty can be a vulnerability just because of a simple financial need. Those next three, the family dysfunction, engagement with children's services, and the history of trauma, abuse, and neglect. We see that so often as a vulnerabilities because we all have needs, especially as young children, and our attachment to our parents, which we'll talk a little bit about more. But when those needs aren't fulfilled in a safe, healthy environment, right, it makes someone who's trying to come along and exploit people, I don't want to say easy prey because that sounds kind of weird, but if you're trying to exploit a person, oftentimes you're looking for people who don't have those needs met in a healthy other area. And so often we see our exploiters do that. Addiction as well is a vulnerability in our field, as well as those who have emotional, physical, and cognitive disabilities. As far as labor trafficking, some vulnerabilities that we see are recent location and migration, self-reported economic hardship, unstable housing is a common one, criminal record history, right? We know that for those who have a criminal record history, it's really hard to engage back into the labor force. And so oftentimes that's an area where exploitation can happen, and then substance abuse as well. So real quick, I want to kind of talk about typologies of sex trafficking. So there are a couple typologies. So what I mean by typologies is sex trafficking and labor trafficking don't only happen in one way. So one of the roles that I play at the collaborative is I run our Survivor Advisory Council. And there's a group of 6 of us that are all survivors of human trafficking in its various forms. And many of us have experienced that one crime in a variety of different ways. So there are a couple typologies that we see prevalent in Northeast Ohio. One is illicit massage businesses that you'll see on the screen. That's actually the #1 venue for sex trafficking that happens in the state of Ohio. So I think it's important to pay attention to. Finesse trafficking is in that context of a romantic relationship where an exploiter specifically groom someone in the context of a romantic relationship for the purpose of exploiting them sexually. So again, it's not so much of this, guerrilla style, real violent style of trafficking that we think of when we watch like the movies. Instead, it's this long-term, slow process of building a relationship. Family-controlled trafficking, over 50% of the cases happen through the context of family. I think we're hearing more of this during the opioid crisis. We heard about, parents with addiction trafficking their children for that drug of choice. Demi Moore even talked, she's kind of a recent public example of this, talking about being sold by her mother. Peer-to-peer trafficking. So you might have heard like, hey, red flag is an older boyfriend engaged with a teenager. And yes, that's true, right? If your teenager is dating a 27-year-old, like wave your red flag all day. But what we've seen is that age gap is beginning to shrink. So we're seeing on college campuses trafficking happening, that college kids are trafficking college kids, high schoolers are trafficking high schoolers as well. And then survival trafficking is that trafficking we talked about for needs to survive, shelter, food, those types of things. And then some typologies of sex trafficking that are, if you are working with juveniles, if you have juveniles, some of the things that we see, right? Strip clubs, escort services, again, things that you don't think of as trafficking, right? Those are like common in our world. Like you're just going out, you're having a good time. But what you don't know is that people are being exploited through fraudulent, coercive relationships on the other side of that. Pornography or pornographic videos or photos, you'll see is a really common thing. If you hang around youth or have youth, you're probably talking about nude pictures and not sending nude pictures and all that internet safety. And so those last 2 typologies is really what we see there.
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia, for bringing us here. We always feel it's really important to understand some of the context and that high-level view of what Alicia talked about, to really understand what people who experience this type of crime and these type of traumas really live with, and what it leads to. And like this webinar says, it leads and potentially creates a lot of mental health considerations. And as family members, as providers, as people potentially living with an experience like that. We want to be educated, and we want to know where we can seek help and how we can support victims and survivors. So what Alicia already said, there are a lot of psychological and physical traumas that people experience human trafficking experience. So these kind of traumas lead to serious and mental and emotional consequences. And that's really what we want to talk a little bit more and shine some light on in this coming segment. While we obviously don't want to compare victimizations, we do want to highlight that human trafficking survivors are amongst the most cruelly abused people encountered in our service systems by police, by hospital systems, and often our social service providers. And the reason for that is that people who experience human trafficking don't just experience one type of victimization. They experience what we call complex trauma, or often also called polyvictimization. So what that means is that there are numbers and numbers and layers of traumas and victimizations that are experienced that create a long line of different ways to cope and manage the experience of trauma, but that create obviously things like depression, that create anxiety, that create post-traumatic stress disorder, that create anger, that create maybe even feelings of sadness, reoccurrent memories. So there's so many different things that this complex trauma creates. So many of you may have heard the distinction between complex post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we have one single traumatic event, which happens to, unfortunately, a lot of people living in our world, we know today that about 75% of the general population has experienced some type of trauma in their life. But often that is a single complex traumatic event, which often still, unfortunately, creates post-traumatic stress disorder. But when we talk about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about these varied and multiple traumatic events that happen to people over their lifetime. This is happening over a prolonged period of time and often is interpersonal in nature. So again, these traumas, especially when it comes to human trafficking, and Alicia laid that out, are often leading people to being vulnerable to human trafficking in the first place. So many of the survivors that we work with and our providers work with have experienced significant traumas of abuse, neglect, sexual abuse before they even enter the life of trafficking, which again makes them so vulnerable to perpetrators recognizing the vulnerability and exploring and grooming them into the life. So the escape is very difficult and often impossible. And again, these mental health conditions play a really important role, because if people are already feeling that they are sad and they need the support, often traffickers scoop in and provide that. We know today that complex PTSD, is something that we're really wrapping our head around. How is it changing our brain? How is it changing our bodies? And we know today that trauma has a really complex impact on how our brain develops. When our brain is traumatized, we know that the rational part of the brain, which usually is in control of our thinking and our emotions, is the larger part of our brain that's usually in charge. But when we're traumatized or have a lot of traumas happening in our life, then the fear center, the amygdala, which is the brain stem of our brain, really is the part of the brain that's most often is in charge. So that fear center of the brain runs the show in most cases when people experience this kind of complex trauma, which you can imagine. I'm sure anyone here on this call can think about a situation in which you were scared, you were fearing for your life or your well-being or the well-being of someone else, and that adrenaline kicks in, right? You're able to move really fast. There's this fight, flight, freeze that's kicking in. But in those moments, the rational part of your brain really isn't much engaged. Rather than that ability to just make it through, cope, survive, move on quickly, react, which is again a survival function, but is not very helpful in the day-to-day experience of our lives.
Yeah, and I think too, this was some of the most empowering education that I got when I was just on my healing journey as a survivor myself, really to understand, right? No one wants to be diagnosed with complex PTSD, right? It's like the extra letter on your PTSD is not a great asset, but it was so helpful to understand what was happening really on a neurobiological level. And one of the ways I always explain it is that fear center, which Kirsti was talking about, right? It's really made to tell us warning, warning, which is great because there are a lot of times we need that warning center to go off. But when you've experienced prevalent long-term trauma, what happens is that fire alarm system's kind of like the fire alarm that goes off when you burn your toast, right? Like no one wants to, we need our fire alarm system in our house if our house is on fire, but no one wants the one where you're like, just cooked your chicken too long, right? And now you're standing on the chair, waving the towel in front of it. That's what happens so often in trauma. And I just remember learning some of this neurobiology was so helpful and empowering to me to really understand, like, oh, this is why, and many of you maybe have friends or family or this, experience yourself, like, this is why life feels like it's happening to me. I'm not like an empowered individual that's happening to life around me.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And I think that what we're trying to say really is that survivors of human trafficking obviously are in need of culturally appropriate and trauma-informed services, right? Because what we're saying is we need to look at survivors of trafficking from a very trauma-informed lens, because some of the reactions and behaviors human trafficking victims or survivors will display, those trauma reactions may not make a lot of sense, may be very counterintuitive to us as helpers, as partners, as parents, because there may be reactions that are really big to something that I, in my rational brain, can make a lot of sense of, but was hugely triggering and triggered that alarm in a brain of someone with complex PTSD. So what we're really are highly aware of is that complex PTSD alters the brain and the way of life for people even long after they're leaving the trafficking life. So we know today that it takes about 19 years for a victim of human trafficking or a survivor of human trafficking between leaving the life and coming back to, a balanced state of being where, there's recovery has happened and maybe that alarm system is healed and under control. But that is a long time. That is 2 decades almost of recovery that needs to happen for someone to not have these constant trauma reactions. And that does not take into consideration the often 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 years someone is in the life before they were able to leave. So that's a very long, that's 3 decades almost we're talking about where these dynamics are happening. So no wonder that victims of human trafficking, survivors, when we encounter them and they're still in the life and they're triggered by their situation, are often angry, they're irritable, their mood changes, their sadness, depression, lots and lots of anxiety. Sometimes even to the point where we see hallucinations and delusions happening because the brain is so overwhelmed and it's just trying to survive and cope. The other element that we need to be highly aware of when it comes to mental health consideration for human trafficking survivors, besides this very, very complex PTSD that causes all these layers of mental health concerns, is trauma-coerced attachment. So what we mean by that is that survivors of human trafficking are tied to their trafficker in what we often sort of describe with invisible chains, right? We don't love that term, but it often helps people understand that this trauma bond that the trafficker created, or really we love this term of trauma-coerced attachment much more, is the reason why survivors do not leave the situations. We often hear, well, why didn't they just leave? You know, you're telling us in this training that survivors of human trafficking come to the hotel, or they write the RTA, or they even go to school. They have access to medical services. Why didn't just tell their doctor what's happening to them? Why don't just tell their teacher? Why don't just walk out and just leave it all behind? Well, the reason for that is this trauma-coerced attachment. You may have heard probably of the much older term, which is called the Stockholm Syndrome, and they're all the same phenomenon. It just sort of evolved in its terminology. And really what it boils down to, what happens in this trauma bonding, in this trauma-coerced attachment, is that when our survival is constantly threatened, and we're constantly in a situation where our personal safety, our life depends on another person, we become very tuned into that other person that is feeding us, that is clothing us, that is maybe nice one day, really mean the next, that is giving us consequences for things we do, tells us that they love us the next. It's a very confusing setup that leads for the human being, any human being, to believe that they are no longer themselves. So there is a loss of self that happens. There is a loss of my own perspective, who I am. It creates feelings of guilt, shame, worthlessness, and it gives that person that they take on this personality of this abuser, of this trafficker, and we become these people that really take that lens of that person and live that life that is prescribed to us. I know it's maybe very hard to understand, but it's that bond that is created through that attachment to really preserve our own being in our own life.
Yeah. And I think a context that makes sense for us too, that's, you know, maybe a little more common, is if you grew up in a household that had a system of mental illness or a system of abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, we know that, you know, when the hand that feeds you also is the hand that beats you, there's a really confusing bond that happens there. And so we see it all the time in trafficking, but I think that it's modeled in other areas of mental health as well.
Yeah, but this trauma bonding or this what we're describing also leads to another layer of mental health concerns, because what we're often hearing from survivors is that it really feels very crazy. And I'm using this term because I have heard it so many times from survivors themselves, describing that it is so confusing and it really feels like crazy making. So it's a very, very difficult situation to be in. So what's used also to create this trauma attachment is the misuse of fear. So fear, this coercion that we talked about earlier. So instilling fear mixed with this excitement of being in this life, because sometimes there is, living in excitement, being, maybe away from another abusive system. The sexual feelings that are intertwined, especially when it comes to sex trafficking, and this intermittent reinforcement of reward and punishment, which really creates this bond, again, is very confusing and creates a very strong tie. So strong, though, that often, and actually most likely, victims or survivors of human trafficking do not self-identify as such. So again, they're in systems, they may be going into a hospital setting to receive medical care, but will not say anything about what's happening to them. So it's really up to us as providers, as supporters, as parents, to recognize some of those symptoms, recognize some of those attachments and some of those mental health consideration changes in behavior, and start talking to a potential survivor about what we're seeing, what we're noticing, and hopefully, help them in the long term to leave the life. But again, that often takes a very long time. So we do have a power and control wheel. Some of you who are familiar with domestic violence may be, recognize this. That really, again, shows how this power and control is exerted and how many different ways of power and control there are. So that breaks sort of that coercion and that threat down a little bit more into how that looks. So you see there's economic abuse, intimidation, emotional sexual abuse, the denying, blaming, shaming, physical abuse. So all of those different pie pieces can be used to create power and control that then leads to that trauma cursed attachment. So we talked about this. It's a perceived threat to survivors. And it definitely isolates the survivor from other perspectives and keeps them very, very focused on their situation and the person who is committing this crime to them. We're going to play you a small little clip. This is Rebecca Bender. She is a national advocate in our movement and a survivor herself. And she describes her experience from her own viewpoint of how this felt really cultic. And I'll turn that on for you.
We might not share the sound.
Oh, you cannot hear that?
No.
So if you go up to the top of your screen, I think there should be an option to share computer audio. Are you seeing that?
That's okay if it doesn't play.
Nope. Do you wanna do you wanna highlight what the clip tries to?
Yeah, I think what she talks about again in the mental health consideration of trauma coerced attachment is this understanding that what we really see in trafficking is that they recently came out of the Avery Center and said domestic trafficking hits every box of what we would apply to cult theory too, and why people get exploited and groomed into cults, why we see them stay there, and then the backside of the mental health considerations that come out of those experiences as well. So she just is breaking down that stereotype of why don't trafficking survivors or victims leave, and that's what that video is about.
Look her up. She has a lot of different things going on if you're interested. So what do we do with this knowledge? And I'm sure if you're on this call here today because you want to support a survivor of human trafficking or someone you're concerned about or your provider, I'm sure you kind of hear from the variety of mental health considerations that we've touched upon, which again can be anything from depression and anxiety to hallucination and what could look like psychotic symptoms, and anything from there to in between can happen, right? Mixed with substance abuse, substance use disorders to obsessive compulsive disorders. We see everything you can imagine in the DSM-5 that can be related to human trafficking. In addition to that, you heard it takes a really long time to recover. It takes a really long time for people to recognize that this is happening to them, for them to ask for help. So there's lots of limitation to treatment. There are lots of limitation for people who need help. One, there's limited access to the services, to the very specialized services that people need. There's often cultural barriers within trauma-informed care systems that are not ready. There's difficulties in establishing really trusting relationship with survivors. We hear over and over again that survivors, that first person that really asks, what happened to you? I'm interested in hearing your story and in you as a person, not just your victimization, are often the most impactful people that sort of opened that door to recovery. So what's really important for us to point out when we talk about recovery and supporting people is that that early stage of safety, that trauma-informed care stretches so much is truly important. That relationship building, that opening the door, giving spaces, offering spaces without the need to rescue, without the need to interfere, even if someone is still in the life, if they're still operating there in that, offering that additional space, that alternative to say, if you're just here for 10 minutes, I can offer you my relationship, I can offer you a cup of coffee. I know you're not gonna stay, but I want to sit here with you while you're here. Let's build this relationship. So creating safety, letting that brain kick back into that rational space, letting that, amygdala relax for a little moment, letting a survivor feel what that's like, just even for a little bit, can really set the stage and open the door for longer term recovery. Yeah. So we know that there are lots, again, I started with that, lots of barriers that are not in our favor, which is again, the limited ability in mental health care. We move very fast, our services are very short term. We often have mandated treatment efforts that are very counterintuitive and counterproductive with survivors of trafficking who have been forced to do things all along. So anytime we exert power and control, it can really create the opposite of what we want. Shame, that feeling of guilt that people bring to our space through the experience that they had, not feeling safe, not trusting anyone, all those things are huge barriers and can get in the way. So setting safety, creating safety in very many different spaces in which survivors interact is very important. So again, I want to really highlight this experience of what we call restorative relationship building. We often see people in the anti-human trafficking space who, mean very, very well, but want to rescue. There's this idea of, when I come across a human trafficking victim or survivor, just take them out of the life. I offer them a hotel room or a shelter, and that is the beginning of a new life. But you all heard that that's not how the trauma coerced attachment work, right? That bond is there. That's not easy to break. And again, it can only be done with these restorative relationships, with trust building. We need to create these safe spaces. We need to create predictability, meaning that if I'm a provider that provides a safe space, I do what I say, right? If I say I don't call the police, I don't ever call the police. Giving new perspective, giving support, giving lots and lots of choices, empowering survivors to envision a new version of themselves, a new version of the future, helping them see that they have strength and power and control, and again, exercising that as much as possible. So creating spaces in which the gifts and the talents can be explored and shown.
I think that too is so important for those of us who aren't practitioners, right? And for many of us who we have relationships, we have spheres of influence, and so much of trauma, what we know is the breaking down of relationship. And so in that healing, it's that building up, and that's that's really a powerful thing that we can offer anyone in our sphere, right? To show up consistent and constantly when we say we're going to show up, to provide safe spaces, just to see and know someone is healing in all realms as well.
Yeah. Ideally, what we wish for every survivor of human trafficking is that they will have the opportunity in their recovery process to work through the very complex trauma that they experienced. So we know today that many of the evidence-based treatments for survivors of trauma that we have available to us are very applicable to survivors of human trafficking. Again, that is choice-based. It is really depending on the personality of the survivor and what they like. But all those treatments for PTSD have in various ways shown to work very well. So cognitive behavioral therapy, especially when it's trauma informed, can be very positive tool. We've seen some luck with exposure therapy, which can be tricky and can be more triggering than some of the others, but it's definitely a tool that's been used. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, has shown to be very helpful for that kind of trauma, especially in that original phase when there's still a lot of triggering, a lot of flooding, a lot of intrusive memories. So that can sort of take some of the intensity away, so a survivor can get deeper into the recovery journey. And lots of mindfulness, stress inoculation training, really being in the moment, recognizing what's happening, and exchanging some of the experiences in a very mindful way. And then we also talk a lot about alternative options to traditional treatment, and really it all goes back to lots and lots of choices and offering experiences that give a counterbalance to the experience that survivors had. When we experience such intense trauma, the body and the mind disconnect, which is another survival method. We need to be able to sort of leave the body behind. There's too much happening in the body at all times, so that disconnection, that taking that away is what occurs during trauma. So integrating that again, bringing the mind and the body back together, experiencing the body is really important with those alternatives to traditional therapies. So a lot of treatment centers and social service providers offer art therapy, journaling, poetry, songwriting. Yoga has been shown to be very effective. Other types of somatic experiencing, body work, drama work. We see a lot of work with horses. So the equine assisted therapy is something that several providers here in Cleveland use with the survivors they work with. Outdoor physical activities, climbing, camping, being out in nature, re-experiencing that. Long-term residential trauma often incorporates that. And of course, trauma and addiction treatment also needs to incorporate that into their regular routine. So really important to combine and again, give survivors lots and lots of choices on what that path for recovery looks like. Do you want to add anything to that, Alicia?
No, you crushed it.
One last element of support we want to add, and many of you, if you're connected to the mental health community, or substance abuse community, how important this building block is. And we cannot stress enough how also important it is in the recovery of the folks that we work with is peer support. So this idea of sharing experiences, being a support for each other, of things that people who have not been in the life probably cannot ever imagine is super important, and really has been highlighted as a very, very important treatment building block. So this coping with each other, getting that validation that, I'm not alone with this. I'm not the only one who this happened to. My experiences are not isolated, is creating lots of comfort. It creates connection. It creates, again, that relationship building, that trust building. And it also creates some flexibility for individuals that allows them to shift between maybe their work with their therapist and their art therapist, also really connecting with people where they can be the expert, and where they can offer guidance and support to others if they're further along in their journey. So very, very important building block. Just one more slide for you before we move to questions. The needs of survivors of human trafficking are vast. I hope we have highlighted that, and there are lots of other needs that we haven't even touched upon. We talked a little bit about the psychological, talked a little bit about safety, which is, further extends into sort of that just creating of safety through relationship and trust, but also through secure housing, obviously receiving adequate mental health support, learning new social skills. We know that life skills and mentoring is something very important. We see that often when people enter the human trafficking life, they're in their early adolescence. Think about they're in the life for 7, 8 years. They haven't received job training. They haven't really explored who they want to be as adults. So that training, that catch up needs to happen, which also often leads to, educational services, learning, conflict management, things like that, getting job skills training. And another element that, again, if you're part of the recovery community in some form or shape, that spiritual element, that reconnecting to whatever the higher power is that we believe in, may that be faith tradition, may that be nature, learning, this unconditional love and trust in people, creating that spiritual community that that person probably didn't have, is another important building block. So there's a lot of services that need to come together, a lot of pieces of the puzzle that need to fall in line, which again, we feel very, very strongly about collaboration and bringing all these providers together so they can create these support systems in unison, in sync for survivors who need them.
Yeah, and very much like the mental health community and our friends there, we really view this healing process as a lifelong journey. Right. Unfortunately, there's usually no finish line for the process of healing, for the services, for our peer support in our community. It's just kind of has to be integrated into our daily life and how we do life in our survivorship.
Yes.
For sure.
Great. So
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been very informative. That was extensive information and very clear and thorough. We do have time for a few questions, so I will allow people to enter their questions in the chat. I have a question too, in case no one else has one, but I did also put the link to the survey for this presentation in the chat. Everyone could please open that up now and take a moment to complete it. It'll only take 2 minutes or so. It's anonymous. Receiving this feedback is really important for NAMI. Also, we'll be sharing this with Kirsti and Alicia so they can see the responses to how this information was received. It's a big part of what allows us to continue to receive funding that lets us do all these programs open to the public for free. So definitely make sure you complete the survey. The question that I wanted to ask, NAMI is very focused on stigma and changing the conversation about mental illness and creating a movement that makes it okay to talk openly about mental illness. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about stigma and shame and being a survivor of human trafficking. There's probably a couple layers of shame there, with not only the abuse and exploitation of being a human trafficking survivor, but also the mental health consequences of being a survivor. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth about the role of stigma in all of this, and how we can, as members of a community, maybe change the conversation in healthy ways.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the toxic shame that survivors, walk around with, from a very young age, often experiencing those things that we talked about cultural trauma, historical trauma, their own victimization from very young. And so often we hear, we know that survivors walk away with kind of that, even their own victim blaming and blaming themselves, and what could have I have done differently, or who could I have told to get help. And so we hear that even 10 times fold with our male survivors. Even still, it takes on average about 10 years for a male to disclose that they experience sexual abuse in our culture. And so much, even so, just talking about it. And, with our Survivor Advisory Council, that's one of the powerful things that we do, is that we, say, hey, this is something we experienced, but this isn't all that I am, right? My victimization isn't the sum of who I am as a human, but we also provide hope and healing for other people as we get to do great things with our lives, right? So even myself having a diagnosis of DID, but I get to say, but I can live in whole, healthy relationships. And as I share, your story, you get to inspire those around to say, the things that have happened to you and the things that we've done, either way, they don't have to dictate your whole identity. They don't have to be the end of the story. There's much more to the story of our lives that we get to live.
Yeah. Great question.
Thank you.
We join you in being anti-stigma. That is important. Yes.
Stigma crushers.
Yes.
Yeah. And we just do you have any final thought on those of us that are maybe not professionals, that are just part of, the Northeast Ohio community? Are there any takeaways you would like to offer us before we end on how we can be, I don't know, trauma champions for human trafficking survivors?
You want me to take this one too, Kirsti?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that education and awareness is one thing that we can all do, right? So we showed up here, keep being educated about human trafficking. What does it look like here in Northeast Ohio? And then I think too, we all, even if we're not a professional practitioner, we all have a sphere of influence. We all have relationships that we know that we can look, beyond the surface to really keep tabs on. Is this person okay? Are they experiencing some kind of shift? Is there something that they need from me in a different way? But also children with vulnerabilities and our young people with vulnerabilities. We have great collaborative partners around Northeast Ohio who, we want to serve our survivors of sex trafficking, but we also want to prevent anyone from becoming a victim and survivor of human trafficking. And one way we know we can do that is to provide one healthy relationship for those who are vulnerable in our community. And there's lots of ways to do that as well. And I think we can all become champions in that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering those questions. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this program. Again, this was recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel later this week. And please also remember to complete the survey evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye.